Hey there! This video is going to be a menu walkthrough and full setup guide for shooting video on the Canon R6 Mark II. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to be covering photography stuff because that's not really what I do. So I'm sure there's a few other people out there making photography guides for this camera. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Josh and I focus on camera gear and videography. So if you're into that sort of stuff, then you're in the right place. All right, so big disclaimer up front here. There's no right way to do any of this stuff. So I'm just going to show you how I use the R6 Mark II, how I set up to get the best possible image quality out of this camera. All right, so here we go. A couple things to get started here. Make sure you are in video mode, not photo mode. And also you want to make sure you set the dial here to manual. You want to be shooting in manual as often as possible to give you the best possible quality. So let's start with that. Okay, we're gonna dive into the menu, and I reset as many things as I possibly could. I had to change a few things just so I could do this tutorial, but a lot of the settings are how they come out of the box. So we're gonna go through the whole menu system. If I skip over something, it means I didn't change anything or I didn't really wanna talk about it because I could spend hours explaining everything in this camera. I'm gonna show you all the stuff that's important and make sure you have the things changed that you need to change. So if we go to the menu system here, there's a bunch of tabs going across the top there, and then there's folders or menus under each one. And so the camera number one, will start at the beginning, and we'll just work our way through. So if you're following along, you can have your camera here, and you can just, change things as you go. Okay, so the first one here is going to be the movie recording size, and for this, we're going to choose the frame rate, codec, all that stuff. So the one that I shoot in the most often is going to be the 4K 23.98 IPB. So you can shoot in 4K or FHD, which is full HD 1080p. You can shoot in 23.98 or 24, 29.97, which is 30, or 59.94, which is 60. And then there's two different codecs you can shoot in on this camera. You can shoot in IPB and IPB Lite. The IPB is twice the data that the IPB Lite is, but I recommend shooting in IPB. This camera doesn't shoot in all eye, so this is the highest quality mode other than the raw external, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So most of the time I'm shooting in this 4K 23.98 IPB, and we'll talk about other frame rates and stuff a little bit later. Okay, so we select that. So the next one down here is the high frame rate mode, and this is what, if you turn this on, this will allow you to shoot 1080p 120 frames per second or 1080p 180 frames per second, and this will only spit out a video file that's in 30 frames per second. So if you're shooting in 24 frames a second, when you put in your editor, you have to slow it down to 80% speed to get it to 24. But we're not going to be doing this, but that's where you turn that on. This one is movie cropping, and this allows you to activate the APS-C crop on this camera, which is a 1.6 times crop, which I actually do use quite often. So this is where you can turn this on and off, and I'll show you a couple other ways to access this a little bit later that's a little bit easier. Okay, sound, the digital zoom is off, but I don't recommend using that anyways. Okay, so the sound recording, if we select this, we want to make this manual. I don't trust the the automatic sound options in cameras, so set your recording level, whatever you need to do before you get started. Usually looking to peak around -12 or -6, but definitely not above that. So make sure you set a little bit lower so you have a little bit of safety, but that'll depend on the microphone you're using, the conditions you're in, all those sorts of things. Wind filter, disable that. Like I said, we want to turn these automatic features off. Audio noise reduction, we're going to disable that as well. If you want to do any processing to the audio, I recommend that you do that in post. All right, so now on to the second camera screen here. There's not much to change because a lot of this will get turned off once we put it in log. We're going to be shooting in log because that's the best way to get the best image quality. So the ISO speed settings here, I will set this manually, but if you do want to change the maximum range, you can change it here, but 25,600 is pretty high anyways, but you can change that. So nothing else going on here. We're not going to use HDR because, again, we'll be shooting in log. A lot of stuff, as I said, will get disabled. So we go to the third screen here, and this is kind of a cool setting, the AV 1/8 stop increment. So if you enable this, and we back out of here, when you change the aperture, oops, I forget what it's set to. We haven't changed these yet. Okay, when you change the aperture, you'll see it changes in 1/8 increments, which is really interesting because it gives you really precise control over the aperture. But also, if you have that set on and you're shooting video, you can make slight adjustments, and you don't see it sort of step as much in terms of the exposure. So I don't usually have this on, but it is a cool feature, so I just want to let you know about that. Okay, on to the fourth page here. The white balance you can set to whatever you want. We will just set this to sunny for right now, but I recommend that you set your white balance manual and you don't use auto white balance because it doesn't lock on. It'll change throughout the shot. So if you're going to color grade it and the light changes at all, it'll be a nightmare. So generally pick a white balance that you think is accurate, or use a custom white balance, which you can here. So it's kind of the normal antiquated method on these Canon mirrorless cameras. You have to go into photo mode, take a photo, and then you go into custom white balance, you select that photo, and it will put a custom white balance in there. So that's what you have to do. I recommend that for, studio setting or, interviews, stuff like that, where you have everything set up to go to a custom white balance. You can do it outside too, but the light changes often, so that's just one of those things there. All right, so picture style. Again, we'll be shooting in log, but usually if I'm not, for whatever reason, I'll be in standard or neutral. But either way, we're not going to be, I don't use that very often. So for the Canon log settings, this is important here. We're going to go in here and we're going to turn on C-Log 3. So this camera only shoots in C-Log 3. If you're in log, it doesn't shoot C-Log. It doesn't shoot C-Log 2, unfortunately, so C-Log 3. So in C-Log 3, there's a couple different options here. The view assist is something that's important. What this does when you turn this on is it basically adds sort of like a LUT onto the screen when you're recording, when you're looking at the monitor or the LCD screen when you're recording. It allows you to get a better sense of what the image looks like, because it adds some contrast and adds some saturation, but it does not bake it into the image. So what is being recorded or what comes out externally is still just the log image, but I do recommend turning this on. So for the characteristics, you can change these. If you want to change some stuff in camera, I just leave these as default. And the color space, please change this to cinema gamut. That'll give you the best chance of matching this with other cameras. So that's my preferred color space, is cinema gamut. Okay, so that is it here for those settings. Page 5 here, we have the lens aberration corrections. So these I turn on. And basically what these are settings in the camera that it knows what lens is attached. You can see right now I have the RF 15-35 on here, and it knows the faults that are in these lenses and it corrects them in camera. So I actually do like this, and the reason for that is that this is going to correct it more accurately than I can probably correct it. And there's a lot of lenses nowadays that are designed that have flaws in them, but they camera manufacturers know what the flaws are and program the bodies appropriately to get rid of those, like distortion, things like that. So definitely make sure you turn those on, but that's really up to you. And if you're using third-party lenses, you're not going to have all these options. So again, if you're using Canon lenses, I would definitely turn these on. Now, the focus breathing compensation or correction is only available on certain lenses right now. Hopefully, whenever they update this camera's firmware, they will have more, so that's where you turn that on as well. It's a really cool feature that I see in the newer Sony cameras, and hopefully, I don't have a lens to test it on it with. I wish I did have one of the lenses that worked with it, but I don't at the moment. So the other thing here is the high ISO speed noise reduction, and this comes default as standard, which is kind of where I leave it. I don't really have a problem with the standard. If you want maximum image quality, then I would probably set this to disabled and then apply your noise reduction in post. But when you apply noise reduction in post, it gives the computer a lot of work and can really slow it down and adds another step. So generally, I didn't like the high from my previous testings. I would probably leave it on low or standard. And if you want, as I said, turn it off. You'll have no noise reduction applied for the high ISO. So that's another option as well. Okay, onto the 6 tab. There's the pre-recording settings. And I haven't played with this yet, but this is really cool where, if you're doing wildlife or sports or something like that, and you have the camera set up, aimed at something, and you hit record, it'll record before you even press the record button. It'll go back, it's always rolling, so it adds that in. So again, this is really cool. I haven't played with this yet, but that's where those settings are. Okay, and then one thing to mention here about the time lapse, this is disabled because of those reasons. You can't shoot a time lapse while you're in log. Another one of the weird quirks about Canon cameras. So again, if you turn log off, then you can do time lapse. And the other thing is, just like with the high frame rate mode, it spits out in 30 frames a second. So again, one of those things you just have to be aware of. So you're gonna have to, change the speed in post. Okay, so image stabilizer modes here. We will access this a little bit later through the quick menu, which we'll get onto later. So let's see what else we have in here. Customize quick controls. Okay, so the quick menu is really important on the Canon cameras, and what's really neat about the newer Canon mirrorless cameras is you can actually edit the quick control menu. So now that we're in the quick menu editing section here, we can actually disable stuff and enable things and basically customize however you want. So I'm gonna change some stuff here because there's some stuff that I'd want to have in there that is helpful for me, so I can dive in the menu a little bit less often. So what we're gonna do here is I'm gonna turn off the I'm going to turn off the picture style and also the digital zoom because I don't use those. And so now you can see there's 9 of 11, so there's 11 spots, so we've opened up 2. So you can basically put in here whatever you want, but things like autofocus area, selecting the card, this is the mic recording level, headphone level, like the subject detection. These are all things that I want to access quickly. But the 2 things that I'm going to add to this are going to be zebras and focus peaking. So those are things I like to turn on and off all the time. So I am going to put those in there. And you can also, if you hit the info button, you can rearrange them. So if I want to move things around, so really, really customizable, really, really cool. Okay, some other settings in here. Make sure you turn this shutter button function. We're gonna go in here, and what I like to do, this is what happens when you press the shutter button when you're in video. So I changed this to start stop movie recording. So the reason I do this is that there is the record button up here on the camera, but I can't ever find this for whatever reason, and every camera has a shutter button. So I'm usually using the shutter button. So when you have it set to this and you press the shutter button, it will also record in addition to that other button. The meter timer, make sure you put this to 30 minutes, and this is basically when the camera's rolling, it'll show the meter on the bottom if you want to use that. I really don't use it very often, but if you like it, then set it to 30 minutes. Well, if you don't know, this camera does have false color, which is super cool, and you really only see that feature in cinema cameras. It's super quirky in this camera, and so I actually don't wind up using it, unfortunately. Maybe this will be addressed in a firmware update, but anyways, if you see it here, it's grayed out. If you click on it, it says there's something wrong with the Canon log setting. So let me show you how to change this if you do want to use this. If you go back to the log settings, which are on page 4 of the camera menu here, you have to turn the view assist off. Otherwise, the false color doesn't work. So if we go back to false color now, you can see you can turn it on. And also the false color index is here. So this is what you'd want to use. So for example, if you're setting exposure with a gray card, then you want to set it to green. So if you forget what the colors are, they're in there for you to remember. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that if you want to use false color, you can't have focus peaking on. If focus peaking is on, then false color won't work as well. So it's a great tool, but again, it it has its limitations and its quirks. So as I said, I hope it does get changed in a firmware update. For zebra displays, what I like to usually do, there's a lot of ways of exposing, and if you're curious about how to expose or color grade C-Log 3, I made a really detailed video about that, and I'll leave that link down below. But the one thing I do use zebras for is to set the proper exposure on a gray card, and that's 35% when you're in C-Log 3, so set this to 35%. Some people use zebras to set their clipping point, but I use the histogram, so again, I just set that to 35%. And we can turn this on and off here, but we can also turn this on and off in the quick menu because we added it to the quick menu. Shooting info display, there's a lot of settings in here. And so basically these are all the different screens that when you hit the info button on the back, this will toggle through. So you can go through and customize all this stuff. There's a lot of stuff in here. Also for the viewfinder settings. One thing is about the histogram, and so I use histogram for judging exposure. So there's one thing here I want to change is the display size. I make this small because if I don't make it small, it's way too big on the screen and I can't see what I'm doing. Okay. Lens info display. This is really cool. This is what happens if you're manually focusing. It'll show the distance you are away, the lens is set to, because these are all focus by wire lenses, meaning when you turn the focus ring on the lens, it doesn't actually change the focus. It tells the camera how to focus it. So it's indirect, it's focused by wire. So I actually disable this. I find it distracting. I don't find it really that helpful, but you can do that, and then you can select feet or meters if you want, but I turn that off because I find it a little bit distracting. Focal length display, definitely that on. That's really cool. That will show you your focal length on the screen. So if I back out of the menu here, you can see it says 35 millimeters. So it's really cool to have that on there. Okay, so going back into here, there's one more thing I want to change here, and that is the recording emphasis. So that is set to on. So let me show you what this is. So if we back out again and I press record, you'll see the red box flashing around the outside. I find this distracting. I kind of like what Sony does, and it's like a solid box, but the flashing kind of bothers me. I do like it that it really lets you know that you're recording, but I just turn this off because I find it distracting. So again, go back in here, shooting info display, recording emphasis. We're going to turn that off. Okay. On to page 8, the quick control screen. So I know we just went in to customize it, but this is something that's different in the R6 Mark II. There's actually 2 quick control screens. So this is the first one that we're customizing, but there's also a second one, which is really handy and takes a little bit of getting used to, but you have to turn it on here because if you don't turn it on here, it won't show up. So we'll talk about this when we dive into it from the main menu a little bit later. So again, we can change the settings here for the viewfinder. One thing here is the standby low res. So I had this already turned off. It comes on by default, and basically it puts the screen in a low resolution to save on battery power, but I have it off because I want to see the maximum screen. I'd rather chew through a little bit extra battery. The battery life's incredible on this camera. Okay, so the thing here, which is on all the Canon mirrorless cameras, which is really frustrating, is this setting here, the HDMI display. So there's 2 options. So the option I'm in right now, just the screen, is what happens is when I have this set up and I have the monitor, that's the way I'm recording this right now, but it could be just a monitor or you could be using this for live streaming or whatever. When you have it on this setting here, the LCD screen on the camera is off and it outputs the image from the camera and also all the on-screen menu to the over HDMI. That's how I'm recording this right now. Now, if I change this to the other one, then what'll happen is it'll show me the image on the screen, all the settings on the LCD screen itself, and it'll output a clean HDMI feed. So if you are feeding this for live streaming, for example, or you are recording externally, then you want to feed a clean feed out over HDMI. The problem with this setting is that you can't record internally. So you just have to pick which one you want. It's just a really silly quirk, but just so you understand how that works. So the bottom one will turn off the screen on the back of the camera, will output the info display onto the HDMI, and the other one, you'll get the normal display on the camera and it'll output a clean HDMI, but you can't record internally. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, other thing here is the HDMI raw output. And I'm not going to turn this on, but this is how you turn this on. As of right now, you can't actually do this. I tried to do this recently, but the firmware for the Atomos Ninja V and Atomos Ninja V Plus is going to be coming out in January of 2023. So until it happens, we can't test this out. But that's where you turn that on and off. And if you want to use timecode, you can check that out here too. Okay, done with all the camera settings. Let's go to the autofocus menu here. And there's a few things I want to talk about. Of course, if most of the time I am using autofocus, so you want to make sure that you have the movie servo autofocus enabled. I think it is by default. And then you can play with, there's a lot of settings in here to play with in terms of subject detection and all that stuff. It really depends on what you're shooting, and you should experiment with all these things, but for most situations, I think the default settings are pretty good. It'll depend on which lenses you're using and, of course, what you're shooting and those sorts of things. Autofocus area, you can really dial this in for what you're doing, but again, for general stuff, whole area autofocus is good. Subject to detect, you can, this is new here, this is auto feature, so you can let it just choose what you want, and from what I've seen so far in my limited testing, it works pretty well. Previously, you have to go in and select people, animals, vehicles, or none, so I've been trying to trust it a little bit more, so we'll leave it on auto for now. But if I am, doing just birds or just animals, I will change that, or just people. But the auto does work pretty well. Eye detection you can turn on and off here, and you can make it choose right eye, left eye, or auto. I just leave this on auto. Now the switch track subjects will determine, if it locks on to the initial thing and stays with that initial subject, or it'll switch more easily. Again, I have it in the middle, so it does a little bit of both. So there's a lot of settings in here. Now, as I said, there's a lot of settings in here which I actually don't change, but you could change as you get more used to these things and experiment with them. So on the 5th screen here, number 5, we have the manual focus peaking settings. And for this, it will really depend on what you like here. But generally, I have it on medium or high and red. If I'm doing wildlife, sometimes I will change it to yellow. It just makes it a little bit easier to see. And you can turn this on off here, but as we already customized the quick menu, you can turn it on and off there, which is pretty handy. Going over to the 6th screen here, there's a couple settings in here, but one thing that's important here is the RF lens manual focus ring sensitivity. And as I said earlier, it's focused by wire. So there's 2 settings in here. One is it varies with rotation speed, which doesn't feel natural at all to me and probably most of you. And that when you turn the ring faster, it will focus faster. I like it to be linear, like you turn it a certain amount, it works a certain amount. So that's the bottom one here. Make sure you change this setting here. So now that we're done with the camera settings and the autofocus settings, let's move on. I don't change any of the settings in the playback or the connectivity stuff. I don't really use that stuff, but there's a lot of stuff in there to play with and experiment with and dial in. All right, so onto the wrench here. There's a bunch of settings in here to talk about. So the first one here, the record functions and card folder selection. This is what allows you to choose different recording options. So if you want to record separate things, like you want like photos to one card and videos to another one, and all the different kinds of settings. So for example, for video, you can do standard, which is just recording to one card. You can have it relay record, so it goes from one card to the next, and then also recording to multiple cards. So if you're doing professional video work, I recommend the record to multiple, so that you got a backup copy in case a card fails. So this is where you change all those settings. Okay, let's go to file name here. And for this, I do like to customize this. For some reason, this wasn't reset, but I use a lot of different cameras, and I like to name the files to be that camera. So when you pull them in the computer, this one will say R6 Mark II. So if you go in here, I already have this set to R6 Mark II, which you can make it say whatever you want. It's already that way. And then down here, let's see, up at the top here, you want to select R6 Mark II. So now all the files that come into your computer will say R6 Mark II and then have a number after it. So that is really, really handy. This is where you can format your card. So it's got to know where that is. Moving over to the second tab here, a lot of people ask me that they don't see the right frame rate. So if you're in North America and you probably want NTSC, which will give you 24, 30, 60, 120. If you're in Europe and a lot of other places, you want to switch this to PAL. It'll be 25, 50, and 100. So that's where you change that. For the mode guide, I want to turn that off. And also for the feature guide, I want to turn that off. This is some of the on-screen display stuff that just gets annoying after you start using the camera for a while. So I turn those things off. For the beep, I disable this. I don't like the camera making extra sounds. This is all personal preference stuff. So for power savings, this doesn't come disabled. I just disabled all the stuff so I could do this tutorial, but I generally leave everything disabled here. But you can, have the screen dim. You can have the screen turn off after a certain amount of time. You can have the camera turn off after a certain amount of time, and then you can have the viewfinder turn off as well. But generally, I'm just aware of it, and I just leave these all disabled. But again, that's personal preference. All right, now onto the fourth tab over here and the screen viewfinder display. There's a couple settings here, and this is what allows the camera to switch between the LCD screen and the EVF. So you can manually choose screen or viewfinder, and there's a few different options here for auto. One of which is if you have the LCD screen open, it will not switch between the EVF and the LCD. So if you have it on that, then you have to close the screen to get it to switch, or you can have it switch if the screen's open. Anyways, there's a couple different options here, so play with those, see what you like. In terms of screen brightness, the screen on the back of this camera is great. Generally, I turn this up pretty high, but if you turn up really high, you can potentially overexpose your image if you're using the screen to help you judge with that. So just be careful. If it's not super bright outside, don't set this up too high because everything will look really, really bright and overexposed. Okay, I think that's it for this page. Let's go to the fifth one over here. And one thing is the shutter at shutdown. And so I like to keep this closed. What this does is that when you turn the camera off, it closes the shutter so you don't allow any dust in. Onto the sixth tab over here, we have the custom shooting modes, which we will get to a little bit later. Okay, moving on to the control section, we're gonna skip over the first and second tab here. There is some custom, this is where you can change the custom buttons, and I actually don't change the custom buttons on this camera. I haven't really felt the need to because of the quick menu and how to customize it, but for most things, the buttons are there or they're in the quick menu, so I'll probably experiment with it a little bit more, but I've been using this camera and haven't really felt the need to really customize a lot of the buttons. But one thing I do need to do is customize the dials. So the top dial here, which is the button on the top there, I always have this to shutter speed, and this is personal preference. This is kind of been doing this for a long time. The dial up on the top here, I changed that one to the aperture. The one on the back wheel, I changed that to ISO. And this is all personal preference, but this is the way I've been shooting on Canon cameras and actually all the cameras for a while now if they have a wheel on the back. So shutter on the top, aperture on the top, ISO on the back. And the bottom one is the control wheel that you find on the lenses. I actually turn this off because I just wind up bumping it a lot and I don't really feel the need to have it. There's so much customization on these cameras, but I just leave that off. But again, if you want to set that to, I don't know, white balance or something like that, you do have that option to change that in there as well. So those are my custom dials. Now onto the fourth tab over here, there's one thing I want to change in here, and that's the audio compression. And again, I want to disable this. I want to get the maximum possible audio quality out of the camera. So those are all the settings in the menu system that I change. If I didn't change anything, that's because I don't change it. So I'll talk about some general operation stuff now. So some general stuff here, and then we'll get into the quick menu, and I'll just talk about my custom modes and stuff like that. So first of all, we're going to be shooting in 24 frames a second. So I'm going to change the shutter speed to 1/50. You know, the aperture can be whatever you want. And then the ISO, we're going to change this to 800 because that is the base ISO for C-Log3. So I usually let that sit at 800. Now let's jump into the quick menu, and to do that, there's the Q button on the back. And as I said before, I don't really bother with a lot of the custom buttons because everything's in here, and you can customize this, which I showed you earlier. So all the things we saw in here earlier, we have the autofocus area. We have, you can select the card. This is where I change my frame rate and recording options right here. So if we want 4K 60, you can do that in here. 4K 24, like I said. And then if we go down here, we have the audio recording, which gives you a nice big meter. So often I'll do that to get my audio level before I start recording. We also have the headphone volume. We have the second screen here. I'll show you that in a second. Now let me talk about stabilization for a second. If you have a Canon lens that has stabilization on it, there's a switch on the side. You can turn it on and off. If you turn the stabilization on the lens, it turns the lens stab on, and it also turns the IBIS or in-body image stabilization on in the camera. If you turn the lens switch off, it will disable the lens stab and the camera's IBIS system. You can't have one on or the other. It's either both on or both off. And instead you do that with the switch. So if I hit the switch, you'll see on the screen the little stabilization thing goes from plus to off. All right, so we'll leave that on. And if you go into the Q menu, this is where you change the digital stabilization. So you can either have it off, so no digital stab. This is in addition to the IBIS, so you can do this independently. So you can have it off or on or enhanced. Enhanced is a lot. If I need a little bit extra stab, I will sometimes use on, but I find that the lens stab, if you have lens stab and the IBIS work really well together. If you do have electronic stabilization turned on, it does crop in a little bit. So keep that in mind. Now, if you have a lens that doesn't have stabilization, you might want to play with it. But again, play with all these settings, see what you like, those sorts of things. We also have white balance. So this is really easy to get to. So this is all in here. And if you're using the custom white balance, that's where that is too. So you can also change it by Kelvin. So I do that sometimes as well. Okay, so we can also, as I talked about before, we can turn the zebras on and off. We can also turn the peaking on and off, which I mentioned before, and you can change the peaking settings just by hitting the info button. So a lot of great options to get in right there. Now, subject detection, which we were talking about before. Again, you can see how everything is pretty much in the Q menu. It's really easy to access. You can just choose what you want. Super easy. So this is the main Q menu, but because we enabled the second Q menu, if we press the Q button again, now we get this second menu, and this is where we turn on and off a couple things. So the movie cropping, which, as I said, the easiest way to get in and out of it is, this is the Super 35, or sorry, APS-C crop. So this is the easiest way to turn it on and off. We also can turn the high frame rate on and off here, so we don't have to dive into the menu system. And then the recording options, like we talked about before. So this is what allows you to not have to dive into the menu as often, and it's much more visual and easy to find everything. Now, if you see the two little dots at the top of the screen there, that means there's a second page. So I just use the wheel and the dial on the top here to go to the second one. You can change the log settings, the movie record side, what we already have on the main Q menu, and then HDR, which is disabled because we're in log. So a lot of different options with the Q menu here. It just allows you to get in and out of a lot of the settings that you need on a regular basis. And as I said, it's really handy, and you can customize it however you want. All right, so sort of the last thing I want to talk about here are the custom modes that are in the camera and how you set them up and what you might want to use them for. So there are C1 through C3, the 3 custom modes on the dial here, and they're separate for photo and video. So if you flip the switch from video to photo, you'll have 3 different custom modes. So use them for certain things. Lately, I've been using this camera for wildlife, so there's a couple settings that I like to set it up for. So let me just show you how to do that. Of course, set up your camera however you want to set it up, but I'll show you what I've been doing. So the first thing is I'm going to set the first custom mode to 4K 60. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go hit the Q button, And I'm going to go to the movie recorded size, and we're going to choose 4K 60 IPB. Now I'm in 4K 60, and I said I'm going to set this up for wildlife shooting, so let me change a couple of settings. First of all, I want to change the shutter speed to be 1/125 because that'll be double my frame rate at 60 frames a second. I want to use the 180-degree shutter rule. Also, I set my aperture to 7.1. This is very specific for my case here because I'm using the RF 100 to 500. And at 500 millimeters, it's at 7.1, so I just set it at 7.1. And the ISO is set at 800. And so the other thing I want to change here is the autofocus. So I'm going to change the autofocus to animals because, as I said, I'm setting this up for wildlife. This is very specific for my case. But anyways, let me show you how I do this. So once I get everything set up however you want it, all the settings that you have in the camera right now will get put into custom mode 1. If you press the menu button and we go to the wrench number 6, custom shooting modes, which we skipped over earlier, we can register the settings, and we're going to put this one in C1. So now when I go to C1, everything that I just had in the camera will be set up for C1. So this is ready to shoot 4K 60 for me for shooting birds and wildlife. So it makes it really easy. And then for me, the other thing I like to do is set up the second one in 4K 60 in crop mode, just to show you how I do this. You press the Q button twice to get into that second menu, movie cropping enabled. So now we're in crop mode, and I can set this to custom mode 2. So now custom mode 1 is 4K 60, custom mode 2 is 4K 60 crop mode. But again, this is very specific for my use case for shooting wildlife. If you're doing other things, you can set all that up and you have your options for shooting custom modes. Well, that kind of wraps up all the settings that I use in the camera, and hopefully you got something out of this. And it's really interesting to see how people set up their cameras because they're all a little bit different because everyone kind of uses their cameras differently, and there's a lot of settings in here. And I recommend that you really look through the menu system and experiment and make changes, especially in the autofocus. There's a lot of things to tweak and dial in there. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the description below. I'll do my best to help you guys out. Otherwise, if you found value in this video and you enjoyed it and you want to see more content about the Canon R6 Mark II or other cameras or other videography stuff, please consider hitting subscribe to get all that content. It also means a lot to me. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.